this is Paul Casey, the Kenpo Karate Hall of Fame Educational Video Series, where we discuss Kempo, principles, forms, techniques, and we also have special guests. And tonight we're very, very fortunate to have one of our Kenpo Karate Hall of Fame members. This is one of the most talented men in the martial arts. He has expanded upon Mr. Parker's writings, and that is why we call this segment Beyond Infinite Insights. So we're delving into an area that Mr. Parker wrote about, but that was 30 years ago. We're blessed to have Todd Durgan with us. Todd is the founder of Phasic Kombatives. He is an author, a very astute writer and philosopher, and he brings the ideas of Mr. Parker's Kenpo Karate to the more modern approach and expansion on that. And I'm very excited to have him here. And he's going to discuss that with us, as well as we have a special guest, Zachary Carter. Mr. Carter is an associate professor in Kempo, and we're great to have both of these gentlemen with us. So hello, Todd. Welcome to the show.
Mr. Casey, pleasure as always.
And Mr. Carter, how are you, sir?
I'm doing fantastic. Thank you.
I know you're in the hood. He's in the hood, baby.
Teaching a lesson outside.
So we're going to talk about some books here, and the books that we're going to reference on simply are some really classics. Is one of my favorites, The Infinite Insights, which I know is one of Todd's. He goes, if you're a Kempoist, I have to be honest, folks, you have to read these things. These are works of art, valuable information, as well as the essence of what Mr. Parker wanted to share. Their concepts and principles, very important. And it is almost unthinkable that if you're not reading these, you're doing a disservice to yourself.
Absolutely.
Okay. As time goes by, we'll find out that material and knowledge and information will be lost in transition, because those that learned it may not be able to share it anymore. Those that have had some kind of introduction to it will be able to expand on it, but it will be their interpretation. And then those that really studied this hard and spent quality time with Mr. Parker and his writings will be able to share that, but that is becoming more limited and diminishing in time. So I'm a big fan of these things. This book here was back in, I can't remember exactly. Forgive me, gentlemen. I have to wear glasses, so I'm going to wear my glasses.
I believe it was 88. Or which book?
Number 4, and it came out in 86.
Oh, my bad. 86.
Okay. As Mr. Parker would say, it is my decision, not yours, when he imparted information on people. And this is it. So there you go. A book that is very coveted. If you can get the whole complete series, there's 5 of them. This is number 4. I will be referencing it. We'll be discussing in it. We'll be discussing chapter 6 and chapter 8. Chapter 6 refers to pages 87 all the way up to 143. And in chapter 8, we'll start off on 149. Just to give you a reference, you can look these things up, maybe listen to the discussion, and then go back and review and whatnot. The other book that I'm very excited that we have here from Mr. Durgan, again, he's the founder of this particular system of the martial arts and expansion on Kempo. He has great roots in it, folks. Don't kid yourself. He knows his American Kenpo very, very well. But he didn't limit himself to only what was presented, the original techniques, original forms, sets, and whatnot. He was more compelled to find out something even deeper. And because of that, he has put together this book. He has a second one coming down the line. And he incorporates a lot of things with it that I think are really refreshing. American Kenpo originally was called American Kenpo Jiu-Jitsu. Mr. Durgan actually expands on that, and he incorporates that and keeps it in the system. We do have that in our techniques in the original system that you study. However, the emphasis is preliminary, I think. So the book that we'll be looking at here, and I will introduce that with Mr. Durgan, and it's right here. And this book is available for those of you that want to get it. It's on Amazon, or you can probably buy it directly from Todd. Todd, why don't you do this, Todd? Why don't you bring us up to speed on the book, the purpose of the book, and what can people learn from this book?
Okay, thanks, Paul. I appreciate the I appreciate the shameless plug. So the book's available on Amazon, as Mr. Casey said. It's available in paperback and in ebook. So that's kind of a nice thing. I have both. The ebook is pretty sweet because you can, if you've used any of the ebook stuff, you can still make notes, you can highlight stuff and everything else and save it as such. And then reference those highlights and notes. Also, okay, so I also have it available on my website at KempoGuy.com, Ken posters and so forth, product page. You can just buy it from me directly. And that's the best way to get it if you want to have a signed copy. Okay, the purpose of the book. So I did not set out to write a book. I set out to write some notes and some information for myself as I was studying things to become a better martial artist and to become a better teacher and a better, I guess, sharer of the system. And in my research and in my notes and along the way, there were some friends of mine that kind of encouraged me to start putting things down on paper for other people to read. I was asked to do a couple of articles and so forth, and some association newsletters. And so I started accumulating enough to give myself a, kind of a theory that I might have enough for a book. And so I started putting it together. And the idea and the purpose was to expand on some of the things that Mr. Parker briefly, in my opinion, touched on in his book, book 4 on the universal pattern, and then completely and entirely and utterly open the door and the conversation about levers and leverage within the martial arts, not just American Kenpo, because I've found it. I was fortunate to be able to take a seminar with Professor Wally J, great man, phenomenal jiu-jitsu, Japanese, small circle jiu-jitsu, with Remy Prasis and many others, and have never in my experience had anybody clarify the difference between the levers and leverage and how they operate. Now there were many times when they'd say it's this, or just do this, or it feels different, and it does, because they are different. And so I wanted to really kind of I thought it was important that be brought to the forefront, because those are, if you look at that, those are elemental as elements. They are the basics and the roots of any joint locks, manipulations, chokes, strangulations, hugs, holds, all of those other categories on the web of knowledge that aren't punches, kicks, and strikes or weapons. And in weapons, the levers and leverage are in the weapons as well. So anyway, so that was the greater purpose of the book. And then in chapter 8 of the book, I shared one of my kind of coined terms, which is sequence rescripting, which is more of a that's a very difficult concept to explain kind of here, but it goes through, it's a cross between the rearrangement concept and grafting, if you will. That's the easiest way to explain it, but it's neither of those things.
Okay, you know what? We can address a little bit. The purpose of this discussion is just to slightly scratch the surface, to reintroduce Mr. Parker's writings, and then hopefully your discussion will inspire them to understand what that was about, and that you use specific teaching aids and lessons that are very important. I always like to quote people that I reference in this, because the reason is foundation is so important. I don't want somebody to say, oh, he just made that up. Oh, who's he to say that? I don't care if it's Todd Durgan, Zachary Carter, or Paul Casey. It depends on what is being said. And so we are looking to certain people that are very influential, that were influenced. Now, Mr. Parker, his impact and influence is so incredible. And we know that for a fact. He is the father of American Kenpo. He took this system and literally took it to an area that no one has ever even thought about. And I encourage you, those that are watching this discussion tonight, to go and visit Mr. Durgan's website. And before I go any further, Todd, what is that website?
It's real easy. It's Kempo Guy at, it's KempoGuy.com.
That's easy. So go there. You can look at some of his videos. You can talk. You can see some of the products that he has to offer, and you'll see how he actually pays tribute to his roots. So for those of you out there going to question, do not question him. This man is very proficient. He knows what he's talking about. I'm very excited whenever I get on the phone with him. I drive him crazy. And it's because it's exciting to see this again. And he has addressed the idea of expanding the information. Or one of the things that he did do, he has a quote on there, and I'm going to quote this, read this quote. It is from the founding Senior Grandmaster of American Kenpo. This is how he honors him. And he says, I further hope that capitalizing on my discoveries will allow those who are interested more time to experiment and exploit other areas needing study. Senior Grandmaster Edmund Parker, Infinite Insights, Volume 5, page 233. How important is that? Because, folks, if you look at that post on the Kempo Karate Hall of Fame, which Mr. Durgan is a member of, it is a way of reflecting. His influence was so powerful that he gave the opportunity for greatness to be celebrated. And one of them was Bruce Lee. Now, I go through the pages and I quote things and stuff, and I don't use them to reference them as that we have to listen to them more than anything else. But I'll look at this. Here's a quote from Bruce Lee regarding truth and how he looks at it. And it's funny because when you look at it, he talks about these things, and the excitement of it is to be truthful and honest. One must be truthful and honest in his approach, a constant independent inquiry, and not blindly follow a certain blueprint laid down by others. You understand what I'm saying? That's reinforcing what Ed Parker just said. So similar minds. Mr. Durgan gets that. He understands that. That's why he put it on his page. That's how important it was to him. I already quoted Ed Parker. Sun Tzu. We always talk about it. We also have discussions on the art of war. And on the art of war, which is a great treatise, and this is the response he says here. And it's regarding tactical. And that's number 14. And it says, hence the skillful fighter puts himself in a position which makes defeat impossible and does not miss the moment for defeating the enemy. Well, how are you going to do that? You have to listen. You have to understand. You have to explore. And that's what Todd has done for us, and he'll be talking about tonight. So it's important. These are all lessons to reinforce what we're talking about. And then the final one that I want to use is from Miyamoto Musashi, and that one is out of the Book of Five Rings. And I've referenced this numerous times on the Hall of Fame. The reason I do this is because it is quite obvious that if you want to celebrate greatness, you better study greatness. Celebrate greatness, study greatness. And when you're a member of the Hall of Fame, you don't buy in. You're not chosen by your buddies. What you get chosen is by your peers. And people look at you and they say, aha. And this is something I'll go to Mr. Carter afterward. And he says here, when men of the world look at things with a wrong perception and do not understand what they see, they say it is a place of no thingness or nothingness. This is incorrect thinking. The idea that men who study strategy and do not understand no thingness, nothingness, do not therefore understand their craft is not correct either. Everything is revealed to all men as they desire it to be revealed to them by their own definitions alone or through their studies. So tonight, you're going to get an insight onto what Mr. Parker's talking about. Why is that important there, Zach, that quote?
Because perception is everything. Perception, when you get up in the morning and you look at something and you're in a happy mood, you see it one way. Maybe you're stressed out, you see it a different way. So perception can change over time too, and can change with more knowledge. So yeah, that's why William Blake and that quote that he used, which basically touch on the same thing that Musashi does. When the doors of perception are cleansed, man will see things as they truly are, infinite. And it is. And when Mr. Durgan lays out this information, it really just boggles the mind. And I think it's amazing work. And I'm glad we're here to talk about it.
Well, we're going to talk about it. Let's get right into this and start talking about it. So, you know, Todd, why don't we build a foundation of what you took from Mr. Parker's writings and then how you develop it as you see it. So let's go into that, the zone theories, the dimensional, the repeated emphasis, checking and controlling zone theory, the outer rim quadrants. I know it's a lot there, but I know you can rip through those very quickly and show how they are and then how you expanded them.
So what exactly do you want me to touch on with the zone theory?
Well,
So
let's
I have
start from there and how you address zone theory.
Well, okay, so zone theory with regard to height, depth, and width zones, obscure zones, and all of that is a very important element because, when you get into zone theory, it is even more relevant to have understanding of the universal pattern and the 9 planes because they are all directly tied together. Now, if the layman has an understanding of the clock principle, they can also borrow that and integrate that to some extent into the zone theory with regard to depth and width, you know, and obscure zones, but when you really want to get deeper into it, you have to go beyond the clock principle because those are directional only with regard to the horizontal planes, right? And when you get to the universal pattern, you then start to encompass and start to include the height and the depth zones and diagonal motion, and then zones of obscurity and everything else, because then you're working on more than just height, depth, and width. You're working with regard to diagonal motion. One of the things that I talk about probably too much to my students is diagonal motion and its use in cancellation of zones, height, depth, and width, because diagonal motion and the 9 and the 6 relative to the 3 and the 2 and the 1, or the 4 and the 7, or the 5 and the 8 relative to the 3, the 2, and the 1, have specific canceling properties that take care of 2 or 3 zones versus if you're functioning on a horizontal, a vertical, or a lateral motion with height, depth, and width. If you're only opposing with height, depth, or width, then you're not canceling more than one zone. You're only canceling its equal, or its opposite. Okay, so zones of obscurity are you guys touched on this in your session the other night.
And I'd interrupt you for a second. Let us review what you did. You came up, you really expanded on Mr. Parker's writing on page, I think it's in volume, is it volume 4? We're looking at his, well, I'm sorry?
Page 169.
Yeah, 169. And you took, and what you did was that you broke that down even more with your idea of the use of the planes. And I'm just showing this briefly. I did a beginning view. I'm sorry, it was as best I could at the time. Can you walk us through real quickly the planes? Because that is just vaguely touched on in his book.
Yeah, let's talk about history, the history of the planes and the history of the universal
I think that's
pattern.
really important. Let's get some foundation on that, okay?
Because in the foundation of the universal pattern, and because this is something that even the people that have read the books hundreds of times don't understand and don't get unless they stepped outside of the Kempo books and the Infinite Insights and took a moment to look at you know, where possibly could these elements have come from? If you look at the Vitruvian Man, you see the representation of the physical anatomy, so on and so forth, in a flat pattern. Okay, you can somewhat overlay that on the universal pattern and get the 8 basic angles of attack that you see in the flat pattern. But where do we come up with 9 planes? Now, one of the things that is interesting to me is that when Mr. Parker's came out with his books in book 4, if you look at that, where he's got that page where the pattern is shown, and he's got the blank flat pattern, and he's got 1, 2, and then it starts on the next line with 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 is all by itself on the bottom. And so they don't really line up. So it takes any context or relationship they have to each other out of the visual think, okay, or the visual perception. So when I put my poster together and that paper you have, what I did was I realigned them so that you have the first 3 across the top, and then you have below that, you have all of the modifiers. Okay, that's great. Where does this come from? It comes from the medical field, where you have the transverse, the coronal, and the sagittal planes. And those are dissections of the height, the depth, and the width. Okay, so you have the number 1 plane, which dissects your height, the number 2 plane, which dissects your depth, okay, and the number 3 plane, which dissects your width, side to side. Now, when you take those planes and rotate them on the intersection of that plane and the next number, so the intersection of 1 and 2, and you rotate 1 down, that's the number 4. When you rotate it up 45 degrees, that's the number 7, okay? When you go to the number 2 plane and you rotate it on its axis where it intersects with number 3, it turns to the 5, 45 degrees to the left, and to the 8, 45 degrees to the right. Or if we're using the clock principle, we would call that 10:30 and 1:30. Okay, the line goes all the way back to 4:30 and all the way back to 7:30. Okay, and then you go to the number 3 plane, which dissects your width. Okay, and you rotate that on the intersection where number 3 and number 1 are, and that turns to the 6, 9. If you're looking at me, this is my 6 and 9. Notice that all of those modifiers are diagonal planes to the original plane. Okay,
Yes.
that's very important, because those diagonals are the most effective means to cancel or eliminate the original plane. They are the most effective.
Well, it's, you know, what you've done is you've really clarified and cleaned it up so it can be understood. What you've done is you put them in an order that makes it makes sense. It's simple. And that was the problem. I don't think Mr. Parker had the time to finish that. He probably would have expanded on it, but life got in the way. So
Right.
I'm glad that you could do that. And now I'm going to go and I'm going to take the opposite attitude towards you. That sounds great. I am so glad you could share that. But what the hell does that matter to me as a martial artist? Why do I need to know that?
So when you learned delayed sword as a beginner, you had somebody show you how to do it, and then they did it on you, and then they showed you, they showed you how it was done on somebody. They do it on you, and then they have you do it. Those are visual roadmaps to the sequence of motion that is delayed sword. Then after you get that sequence of motion, they start to teach you theories and concepts and principles that come along with that. Well, when you have a roadmap of motion, of preferred or ideal motion, lines and paths of action, then you have something to relate to the student to be able to help them execute in the proper method and in the proper angle and the proper depth and the proper lines on their opponent or their partner as they're practicing these techniques. So ultimately, what it does is it gives the student a visual roadmap and a visual key to say, okay, my hand sword, my outward downward diagonal hand sword needs to be working on a number 9 plane, needs to be working on number 6 plane. My inward block needs to move in number 5 direction on a number 1 plane. Okay, so we have, and anytime you have, okay, I'm going to get all excited and go off the deep end here, but so it's ultimately what is the purpose for knowing this? The purpose for knowing this as a student is to be able to have the visual cue or key to what is proper and what is not proper with regard to execution in the ideal phase. Well, everybody wants to talk about the ideal phase. Okay. Now, when you get into the what if and here we are and right now phases, okay, then things change a little bit. But what doesn't change is that the ideal angle relative to your opponent doesn't change. So if they're bent over, angle's an angle to the spine. It still needs to be an angle. It might be a different plane for you, but you know that 45 degrees from that spine is this plane or that plane. None of that comes out in combat.
Why is that?
You shouldn't be thinking about that in combat.
It should be second nature.
Yeah, that's all. Your training and your visual training and your physical training should be preparing you for combat, for an unconscious event.
Okay, while we're on the subject of that preparing for an event, let's add somebody that just showed up. He's coming on very second. We'll introduce him in a moment, and he can comment on this if we can. We'll see how that goes. Okay, so basically, what you've done is expanded on teaching aids to assist a student to visualize how the responses should be applied or executed.
Yeah,
correct?
They're simply tools of learning and tools for teaching. And incidentally, you know, the opening and the start was great with the Miyamoto's Musashi and all the quotes, but ultimately a scholar cannot be a scholar without still and first being a student.
Absolutely.
Sure, absolutely. Well, there's a very famous quote. Why don't you give that for us, Mr. Carter, about the teacher and the student?
I don't know which quote you're talking about.
Well, the vigilant instructor is always the ever vigilant student. So there you go. Thank you very much. We got that going. So we're here. I knew it would come out. It's late.
I'm getting into this conversation, but one thing that I would like to ask Mr. Durgan is by using those planes, don't you make your strikes or your techniques more effective?
Very much.
Because that's the way I'm looking at it. It just opens the doors up because you know, if you're using like the number 9 plane in delayed sword, that strike is going to cancel height, width, and depth and add more power to it. Correct.
Correct. Also, you're also and I must point out that the other and the more primary reason for the better or greater understanding of the universal pattern ties in with the jiu-jitsu and the joint locking and manipulation, because joint locks require 2 points of pressure and 2 lines of action to maintain cancellation. So it looks like you want to get into something else before we get into that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
And we will. Let's welcome Senior Master of the Arts, Dennis Conatser. Hello, Dennis. Welcome to the discussion. You can say hello to Todd and to Zach.
Hi, Todd and Zach.
Mr.
How you doing, sir?
No, good.
So we're walking through right now. We were talking about zones, and now we were having Mr. Durgan discuss and define the planes. Todd, why is it important, besides teaching, that we understand what these planes are?
Effectiveness, and they're tools. They are, and make no mistake, they are merely tools to teach and to learn proper motion and proper principles and concepts. And as Zach had stated, effectiveness, ultimately, what is my goal? My goal as a teacher or my goal as a student is to be the most effective practitioner or the most effective teacher that I can be. And in order to be the most effective teacher that I can be, I'm going to use the greatest tools available to me to convey the message to my student.
I think your greatest tool is your mind, not some physical item or whatnot, because it is unlimited. And Mr. Parker knew that. And we can talk about that with Mr. Conatser in a second. Why is there such a stoppage or a pushback on receiving this information, or at least exploring this kind of information in our Kenpo community?
I think part of it is that to some extent, people don't, well, no, to a greater degree, people don't want to feel inadequate. And they don't want to feel that, okay, I've had book 5, or I've had book 4, or I've had book 3, and I've read it 3 or 4 or 50 times, and I've never gotten that information out of it. So who's this Todd Durgan guy comes along and says, hey guys, this is the universal pattern in its full regale and glory, you know? And then they're going, but I don't, you know, and one of their students bought one of my books and said, Mr. So-and-so, why is this, you know, this is what you said, and this is what he's saying, and so what's right? You know, for the same reason that so many teachers and instructors do not push or promote Ed Parker's Infinite Insights.
And why is that?
Because it's much easier to not be questioned if the student doesn't have a question.
I see. So it's really an injustice is what we're finding now.
So it's a terrible injustice. And I think Mr. Conatser could agree with that.
Yeah, now we're going to go there right there. Mr. Parker had a philosophy about American Kenpo. He wanted to be a thinking man's martial arts. He wasn't saying that you had to know everything. You just had to be exposed to everything and to understand what that was when it comes to techniques, forms, sets, and terminology and principles. Eventually you'll find your own path. Am I correct on that, Dennis?
I seek not to know the questions, but to understand the answers. Pee water, my friends.
Oh,
Pee
my-
water.
I pee
You
water.
sound like you're drowning. Come on, Dennis, let's get it on
I
here.
gotta
Come
say-
on. Why
I
is
gotta
the
say-
Kenpo, let's get in here. What is wrong with the Kenpo community? Why won't they, I mean, they're embracing American Kenpo. They look at Ed Parker, okay, and they say, Mr. Parker, oh, I love Mr. Parker. He's great. They praise him on the social media. They said, oh, this about it and that about it, Ed Parker. They have all their own opinions of the man. Half of them, I would bet that 80% of them never even met the guy. Okay, honestly, I'm sorry. That's 30 years ago. So if you're 40, you were 10, I doubt it. If you're 50, you might have met him at 20, unless you were in Pasadena or one of his schools and he came to visit. What's the possibility you might have saw him 3-4 times a year, maybe at a seminar, a couple days at the internationals? You pick up his magazines, the books and whatnot, but that's not the same as spending quality time with Dennis Conatser or Todd Durgan. They're going to flush it out because you're going to have a responsible to yourself to say, I don't feel comfortable. I was privy to a lot of that. I actually had firsthand experience with Mr. Parker and through Frank Trejo. And you, by the way, I love the fact that Mr. Parker always recognized talent. And if you look at volume 4 of Infinite Insights, it is truly a pleasure to see Mr. Trejo's pictures in there and used for the drawings. He was an incredible human being and his contributions are immeasurable. But Dennis, why is it, you know, everyone wants to run around and say, oh, I'm an Ed Parker student, you know, and they don't even embrace the simplest thing, something that nobody's going to question you on. You grab a book, you grab this book and you say, you know what? I heard Mr. Durgan, I'm going to read this book. Nobody's looking over your shoulder. Nobody's asking you, did you read chapter 3 or 7? Do you understand the concepts of zone theory, you know, or the outer rim or the universal pattern? But they don't want to do that. I don't know.
They don't even know who Ed Parker is. You know, they don't even know who Ed Parker is. You know, the thing is, yeah, you know, he put these books out, you know, 35, 36 years ago. And obviously everybody wants to pick up a name. This is kind of likening to being 30 years after George Washington passed away. There's going to be a lot of people go, hey, I knew George Washington. He was my general, you know. And then a few years later, a little farther and farther and farther along, more and more people died, and they didn't even know George Washington, you know. But they kept telling stories about him. Here we are, you know, 200 years later, and we're talking about George Washington still. So everybody wants to know what. But I wish I would have met the guy, you know. And it's the
Well,
same
you
thing
know
as
what?
that.
I hate to say this to you, with our present cultural situation right now, they're trying to eliminate him too. So, you know, that's sad. What it does, it doesn't serve somebody's purpose. When their purpose is no longer there, the need is no longer there. Am I right,
Oh,
Zach?
Oh, absolutely.
They eliminate Pepe Le Pew and now Dumbo and Peter Pan. Forget it. You know, I'm moving to Mike Stone's Island and taking my VCRs with me.
But let me interject something, if I may. Let's take what Mr. Durgan has done here. I hear so many times, and I can't read off the quote exactly, but Mr. Parker talked about his art evolving, that if you're doing it the same, you're doing his art a disservice. I think a lot of people misunderstand and misuse that quote. And I think Mr. Durgan has taken the universal pattern and the way he breaks it down and analyzes it and uses it. He has evolved Kempo, and he's evolving all these tools for all this information for all of us to understand. And to me, it's just exciting. And I think that's what Mr. Parker meant when he basically said that quote.
I don't know that I've evolved Kempo as much as I've merely evolved the message of Kempo and the understanding.
The understanding, yes.
Well, here's
Absolutely.
the quote. Here's the quote. Let's go and I'm going to hit the quote. This is directly from Mr. Parker's book, The Zen of Kempo. Okay, change. And if the word was change, and a lot of people have been using that word change, but I think they're misunderstanding what he's saying about change. A true martial artist is not one who fears change, but one who causes it to happen. That is what he's talking about. Causes it to happen, okay? Second thing, to live is to change. To obtain perfection is to change often. Finally, he says, change comes with conditions of moods. Parker basically was saying it is inevitable that we will have change. What he's looking at is the evolution of refinement. He's trying to refine it. What we've done here is that he came in with the discussion of the angle/planes. Mr. Durgan, in his wisdom, saw that and said, you know what, we need to explore that. There's the book. You get this book out and you explore that with him, and he tells you about what the understanding of the planes are. And that's in his chapter 2. The importance of that, he's trying to help the readers to understand it, because there wasn't as much text that was given dedicated to that book in volume 4, which is sort of sad. But Mr. Parker wasn't planning on leaving it, so he would have probably have covered it later on. We're fortunate to have Todd to explain that. So Todd, aren't you implementing you know, the refinement in evolving it through Mr. Parker's writing?
Let me after that. Let me take that, Todd. Let me break in. I think Todd was exactly right. You know, he's what he said. I don't think he's evolved it either, but I do totally agree with him that he, and like many other of us that are into this, we're just taking the base that Mr. Parker put out, and several of these areas he obviously laid out, but he didn't explore to the, you know, I mean, nobody knows what was in Ed Parker's mind about those planes. If Ed Parker was here now, he'd probably put us all to shame with those planes. You know, he's the one that started those things and kind of enjoyed that pattern. Todd's done an incredible job, and I, as everyone knows that ever talks to me, I always encourage them to talk to Todd, get his book, get his posters. The stuff is extremely good. I think it's a lot of fun, and we're going to areas that are unexplored, let's say, and Todd's doing a great job of bringing light to the universal pattern in a lot of ways that people have never even thought about. And a lot of these guys that think all they know is they know the term universal pattern, and they know the one plane picture of it that's on your shoulder, and that's it. They don't really understand. If you start asking them about planes, they don't even have a concept of planes or the term orbits or reorbits or whatever. They've used very little. So I think we all are doing the same thing, and I agree again with Paul. When they think change, everybody thinks change means let me create new techniques, let me create a new system, let me just dump Ed Parker altogether, and let me just take claim to this stuff. Well, the thing is, Ed Parker didn't create a punch or a kick or a block or an elbow. All those things were already there. What he did do was put an incredible system down. And what he wanted us to do, which is what I think exactly what Todd's doing, and I hope I'm doing the same thing, and picking different topics, but there's many facets to Kempo. And I think we all need to explore all these facets, and not everybody can do everything or go down every facet, so Todd, more people need to listen to Todd. More people need to pay attention and go to book 1 and go to book 4 and take a look at these things and say, gee, what are the quadrants? What are the zones? What is all this? And let's explore those more than just identify them. Mr. Parker identified the pattern and identified the planes. Todd is going a bit farther into the understanding and the utilization, and ultimately, the better you know that, the better you can effectively apply our movements that move along those planes, because we've learned how to use motion and apply them to those planes on an actual opponent or in a circumstance. And I think that's where we're making change, even though we're not and we can make new techniques too. But then again, all our techniques are made up. I can almost guarantee you, I can take one of Todd's techniques that he's made, some of the new ones, and I can almost bet you that every technique that he has, I can probably dissect it. And I can say, oh yeah, that move is from delayed sword. Oh yeah, that move is from sword and hammer. Oh look, that move is from deceptive panther, et cetera, et cetera. So we're not creating new moves necessarily, but we are creating new actions and activities and a plethora of different ways in which to react to a stimulus.
I
And
think
that's,
I want to say this real quick on this. I think there's a misunderstanding of the word change.
I agree.
Change means, we just have to disregard and get rid of it. No, when we evolve, we are changing, we are growing. It's sort of like water, a flower. It's starting to evolve. And because of sunlight, which is knowledge, and the care of an instructor that has taken an interest in it, and then he writes it down and shares that, guess what? All of a sudden you got the gardening service of Dennis Conatser.
Well, and the thing is, there's roots to Kempo, and there's a stalk to Kempo, the plant. Let's talk Kempo as a plant. There's roots to that plant. There's a stalk to that plant. But yes, there's ever-changing leaves, that are growing in this plant until it eventually grows into a big shade tree, let's say, and maybe even create and produce flowers and or produce seeds and offspring, which then go on and grow. You agree, Todd?
Yes, I actually have a little thing that I wrote. It's called Kempo as the Tree.
Why don't you read it to us then?
Well, I'd love to, but I want to find it first. Let Zach say what he wants.
Let Zach talk.
Well,
Zach,
I just wanted to clarify what I was meaning before. What I think Mr. Durgan has done is he's evolving, because I am studying this, he's evolving my perception of the use of planes and the universal pattern. And I think as a Kempoist, we all should be striving to do that. And that's why I think this is an amazing work. And the more I delve into it, the more it intrigues me. And I'm sure I'm going to be asking him and bugging him with questions as time goes on. You can count on it.
Let me clarify my statement too. Not to have walked on your statement, Zach, because I agree with you there. It's an interpretive thing of evolving, and I do agree it's evolving. I think evolving or growing. We can probably call it many things, but it's actually let me use a better word, enlightening all of us to something that's already there that we just weren't aware of, or we hadn't really studied much of. We hadn't gotten to that much depth on it, et cetera, et cetera. Something to that effect.
Well, remember,
Key
when the
here is
doors
the
of perception
focus.
are,
The key here is the focus. I don't care what the
Yeah.
semantics is. I've always used this before. If you speak German, French, Spanish, or you're a mute, you can't use sign language, okay? The bottom line is the interpretation. It doesn't change what the object is or the subject is. It's still the same. It's just the way it's being conveyed. The focus is what we're trying to do. When we all walked in, we were white belts, and we were white belts in knowledge. It took our seniors to be able to help us guide us down a path. And that's what's doing right now. Parker laid it out. Listen, Mr. Parker was also a teacher to people that we admire to this day. Great, talented martial artists that went on to being successful in competition. Some were very successful in the entertainment world. And a lot of them are now being successful as teachers. Todd is talking about the teaching aspect. So go ahead, Todd, tell us what you were going to say there.
I found this Kempo as the tree. It's a philosophical thing that I wrote a number of years ago. Basically, it goes, the fibers of Kempo or concepts and principles cover a vast array of things, both motion and style. Do not confuse the fiber of the tree for the creationism of an individual using those fibers. While it is true that Mr. Parker created a great system of study, and in the American Kenpo curriculum, he was using the fiber of the same tree that all styles use, i.e. kicks, punches, blocks, etc., and have used for hundreds of years. When I cut down a tree, I can make many things, the same or different from the fiber or materials that tree yields. If I pass part of that same tree to a friend and they build something, it is not my creation, only the same material. The object that was built may look like the same material, but will only be a superficial resemblance. The form and function of it will likely be different. But if I show them how to build the object step by step, then it is my influence that brought about the creation of that object. However, it is the method, not the thing that they created, that was mine. So in other words, it was my method that helped them create that, not the thing.
Not the thing, not the object.
If we look at the physical things, sequence in sets, forms, and techniques that Mr. Parker created, we can say that those are the tree, and that the use of the tree is the instruction or method of use. However, if a person uses a method not put in place, it is the same, or is it the same, or is it different? Question mark. And remember that this is something that's in a manual of mine. Is it a part of the same tree, or is it a different and new tree grafted into the first for the purpose of higher learning? Now, if we look at the basics of all systems as being pretty much the same or of the same tree and only different branches, then we can say that method is in fact of the same tree or roots. That method is in fact of the same tree or roots, sorry.
So let's take your planes concept and start to flush out what Dennis talked about. Everybody wants to have the shiny paint job.
Right.
But
and
they don't always have the car that can go with that paint job. All right.
And typically they talk about the fancy hearts, the blue moons, and the green clovers. And they're magically delicious.
Oh, they're magically delicious.
And that's all they've got.
So we have that going. It's sad because we're into serious. I mean, we are Kempos. We are proteges of the Ed Parker system. Now, if you don't want to be that, then don't profess to be that. But you've spent a lifetime of trying to study that. Why don't you explore all of it? You can't just pick and choose and say, that's it for me. But you can. But are you really doing yourself a service or an injustice? The man laid it all out for us. So again, it seems like we're more interested in the appearance rather than the depth of it. And I've had this conversation with Mr. Conatser, with Mr. Carter, and obviously with you, Mr. Durgan. You know, people come in there and they're fearful of three ways. They get up in front of Parker and he'll ask a question and they don't know the answer. Or they're scared they're going to say the wrong answer. Or they feel they're going to answer something and embarrass Mr. Parker he doesn't know what to say for that, which, my friends, if you've ever been around him or a true student of his, you don't do that, because he will come back and start to go through that with the Socratic method. And it was very interesting. We are supposed to be thinkers. If you're a teacher, you're supposed to be a thinker. You're supposed to help these students to understand. And you grow with them, as I mentioned before, with being the ever vigilant teacher. Instructor is also the ever vigilant student, learning all the time. And I go back and revive things that I thought would and changed, evolved, because my thinking changed. Yeah, you know, I can only use this as a father of 2 children. I never had a child before, so I didn't understand what it was. And I learned trial by fire with my first one, because she was a child with special needs. But my greatest lessons were learned from her, the importance of life, that things were not important, people and moments like this. This is an educational moment. And so I'm not trying to say that I'm better or worse. It was just an experience that I now understand. Okay. And I feel I'm a better person because of it, because it makes me more in tune with others and more sensitive to it. So let's get into a few things real quick, Todd. You took the planes discussion and then you started to flush out the universal pattern. How does that correlate with one another? Why should we use those together in our teaching of Kempo?
With the universal pattern or with leverage?
Well, you can go either way. I'm going to leave that up to you.
Okay, so, well, the planes are a part of the universal pattern, but so we have to understand proper angles of incidence, angles of execution, all of those things that are in your Ed Parker terminology. To be a more effective martial artist or Kempoist, you need to have an understanding of the angles. What are the angles? How do they affect, cause and effect of certain angles, cause and effect of lines versus paths, and the geometry of the universal pattern is directly, and the understanding of that geometry directly affects the understanding of the student and their effectiveness with regard to geometric lines and paths, and how the interaction with an opponent, an assailant, or a partner happens.
Explain then the differences between lines and paths.
Okay,
this
so
looks like a bunch of squiggly up there my son scratched on a piece of paper.
Right.
Well, what's the difference between a line of action and a path of action?
Okay. You want me to answer that? I'm ready.
Yes, sir.
Okay. I thought Dennis was going to go off on a tangent there.
Oh my God.
So the easiest way to describe this would be a line would be the actual point of my finger traveling either circularly or linear in a line to its target. Okay. It covers basically ultimately a very narrow strip of space along the way, whereas a path has 2 points, two sides or 2 ends, and it covers everything in between those 2 ends. For example, a sidewalk, right? It is this wide and it covers that path, whereas a curb is only this wide and it has a line next to that sidewalk. Does that make sense?
Is a path already predetermined?
Well, no. So
Is a line predetermined?
Don't misunderstand. Lines and paths are not predetermined. Absolutely not. Lines and paths are derivative of necessity. Okay. Lines and paths can be determined through offensive and defensive actions. However, you can change those. Okay. For example, one of Mr. Parker's favorite things to say was, if you touch him, hurt him, right? Okay. So if you're executing an inward block and you're touching them, you're going to hurt them. Well, that was a path. It was meant to be a path, but it still struck. So it's no longer just a block. It's now an offensive maneuver. Okay, so lines and paths are just as interchangeable as offensive and defensive maneuvers, and a product of necessity.
But the inward block goes on a line of action or a path of action.
No, it's a path.
It's still going on a line, point A to point B.
It is, but it's covering a path. It's going in a direction, and it's covering a path.
So where would a line be?
Well, I told you a line covers minimal distance.
Give me an example.
You have a line of action, and you have a path of action.
Okay.
Okay. So I can slice, and that covers a line of action. That's a line. Okay.
Looks like a path to me. It looks like you're going on plane 2 or something there.
No, it's a line. A
Okay.
path would be as I'm coming across, and I have 2 points, and everything in between is the path.
Okay, so you're using the size of the path to determine. Okay, I see what you're going with. Okay,
correct. That's how now again, I'm not Ed Paca, and I'm me, so I define it that way.
I think, it sounds crazy because I always think out of the box, but I'm thinking a line can just develop on its own. You can send something, all of a sudden it just free form, where a path is predetermined, as you said, but by defining points.
If you look at the pattern behind Zach, and you look at the diamond that is the center of that pattern, okay, with the flower in the middle, that diamond from your star block set here, okay, has 2 lines down, and in between those 2 lines is the path.
Okay.
How's that? Now, conversely, as I come up the line with my upward block, and I catch that and then rotate into my path, I've covered a line and into a path.
So a line can become a path. Can a path become a line?
Sure. As I'm here and I drop down, right? I come in and I drop down. Now
So opposite and reverse.
Transferred that path and changed it into, or converted it to a line of action.
So it's interchangeable is what you're saying.
Absolutely.
Okay, just want to make sure people are out there looking at that squiggly circle with all those funny little lines in it, and they're not sure. Yes, Zach.
Mr. Durgan, in regard to planes, maybe I'm jumping a little bit. Can you compound planes, and what would be an example of that if you can?
Absolutely. I talked about that with the joint locking. You have to compound planes in order to maintain control with any joint lock.
Can you give us an example?
Yeah. So if let's look at the technique twisted twig. The attack is just a simple joint lock. It travels on one plane. What plane does it travel? Rotates on a number 3 plane. Okay, you're rotating this path on a number 3 plane, utilizing a particular lever. We aren't going into that right now. Okay. As I do that, that allows what?
Go ahead.
No different. No different.
When you're doing the bend, you never bend straight back toward the elbow. You always bend to a 45.
Let me finish. Disgruntled one.
Hey, that is the golden disgruntled one to you.
Right. So typically when you see a beginner doing this, and I've been to Aikido classes where I've seen them doing exactly the same thing. They do this with a line of action on a number 3 plane. Okay. That they stay on that 3. The proper way to do it, as stated by the golden one, is diagonally. So it's ironic to me that the technique is set up to be done on a number 3 plane, which is improper. So you can only do the technique twisted twig if that is executed improperly. You understand that? Because if they take that and they do a 45-degree angle, remember what I said earlier in the discussion, that diagonal motion cancels height, depth, and width. Okay. If they do that on that 45-degree angle that Mr. Conatser is talking about, you will not be able to execute twisted twig.
Well, moreover than that, I'm looking at anatomical development. When you turn that arm more, if you go straight, there's still latitude of movement. It still hurts. I mean, you can still tweak it down if you go far enough. You bring those fingers back far enough. Sure, it'll work and it'll hurt to a degree. But if you twist it, now you're putting the arm in an anatomical tight spot where it actually works even stronger, which I would say complies or agrees with. It's not just going on one plane, it's going on another. But by picking this other plane up on the 45, you're actually controlling them and actually causing more hurt. Not necessarily because you're canceling, but because you're applying a anatomically more pressure on the joints.
You're canceling height, depth, and width. The question was, can you compound planes? And I was asked to give an example. When you turn this and this simultaneously, it turns into this, which is compounding planes. So if you execute on a number 3 plane and a number 2 plane simultaneously, you're compounding those 2 planes, it then becomes that 45-degree angle. Or I can say, oh, guess what? I'm working that on a number 9 plane or a number 6 plane. So compound planes ultimately end up being one of the other planes. Where you truly compound planes is when you're moving something and rotating it simultaneously, either front to back, side to side, up and down, and rotating it simultaneously. So if I'm pulling something down and rotating it, now I'm compounding planes. That makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess I'm looking at it more from what you're saying is correct. I agree with it. I guess what I'm looking at more is what those planes do by changing like that is also controlling or manipulating the structure of the arm or whatever, and that's what's creating that stronger movement or more efficient movement, by manipulating the body in multiple ways versus just one way. You're actually doing it one way, a diagonal, but by doing a diagonal, which is compounding two planes together and moving around or torquing or turning, you're actually getting a greater benefit because you're anatomically putting the other person into a real bad position, and at the same time, of course, keeping you in a safer position while putting him in an extremely awkward position. Correct. and or hurtful position as well.
Now, if we take twisted twig, if we take that same technique, and I want you to try this if you have a student with you sometime, and you as you take the wrist lock on the number 3 plane and turn it to the number 9, then instead of just doing this and this, moving on a vertical line, twisting it forward and turning it at an angle, instead of doing that, now compound it with a 3rd plane and jam that into them forward, down toward their groin, and see what happens. Inevitably,
Would this be an example of an angle of cancellation?
Absolutely.
Okay, I just want to make sure that we throw these little terms in here, but we're trying to keep it simple. Obviously, the biggest problem we see is that in the application of the techniques, we fail to eliminate all 3 of those zones if it's possible.
Right.
And I think that is this is important for your teaching, because you want to have the greatest advantage over your opponent. And Dennis, you're looking for compromise. That opponent's being compromised. He is being checkmated by these kind of actions, right? Am I right on that?
I think what's happening, the question is, why is this not taking place? And it goes back to something I've said a long time ago. It's basically because our teaching over the years has been relatively poor. Most of the time we've been taught by parroting or copying whoever's showing us. And a lot of times they weren't that good. Not everybody had the opportunity to have Ed Parker sit there and show you something who also, really understood this stuff. And so Todd's got a greater understanding of these angles of execution, and which also can turn into planes. The planes are just the path of action that this activity is going on. But we have so much to Kempo that most of the time has been taught by teaching topical techniques and not explaining, number one, exactly what the attack is and what the exact defense is for. And more specifically, what we're talking about here is how to execute a said technique in detail versus just simply a topical beginning overview.
Well, the problem is we're also teaching old techniques from the 80s.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And
to throw that in.
that's like saying, I'm
Sorry,
still blowing,
Todd.
I'm still blowing my nose like the 40s, you know. So
let's get down to basics. The bottom line is there's only 2 arms, 2 legs, and your responses have to be calculated, and that is going to be determined by your teachers. If you're inspired correctly and you know the principles and concepts that we're talking about today, it will give you a better insight to understand what Parker was talking about with the universal pattern and the use of the planes and understanding. So, Todd, where in your book do you really explore these things that we've been talking about?
With regard to, well, that particular subject is in chapter 3, where I start breaking into levers and leverage.
what page is that on?
Chapter 3.
Yeah, what page?
Chapter 3.
Chapter 3. You go look it up, sir. Break it down.
I have not read. I've not read page 26, wise guy. I haven't read the book. Okay, I wrote it.
I love it.
Well, since we're talking about levers,
Let's
what
get
are the
into
type
it,
of
baby.
levers?
Come on.
What's that, Zach?
Bring it on.
Since you mentioned levers, what are the type of levers, and how is it going to make our understanding of Kempo better?
Yeah. Well, it should make your understanding of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness better, because everything that you do is requires and includes leverage and levers. Your body function from the very time that you get up out of bed and put your shoes and socks on is a manifestation of leverage. Okay. So there are 3 basic classes of lever. Okay. Guess what they are? First, second, and third class. Real tough, huh? So the first class lever is the most commonly known and the most commonly understood with regards to its operation and its basically teaching how levers and leverage work. Okay. First class lever is like that of a teeter-totter or a seesaw. You have a fulcrum, effort, and load, and a lever. Okay, and I should go backwards 1 step to say that every form of lever or leverage must contain and have within it the 4 basic elements of leverage. Okay, they are the lever itself, the fulcrum, the effort, and the load. 4 basic elements, and they all have that. The irony here is that leverage and levers, the classes of levers, are merely a rearrangement concept or rearrangement principle of those 4 elements. So we have the first class lever, which is the teeter-totter or the seesaw. Okay, you have the fulcrum in the middle, the effort or the load on either end, and the lever, which is connecting them, or what I call the action line.
What's the difference between the effort and the load?
Well, the effort is what's moving the thing at the other end. So this is why a teeter-totter or a seesaw is not always the best example, because at one point you are the effort and at one point you are the load. When you're doing the seesaw, when you push off, you are the effort, they are the load. When they push off, you are the effort, they are the load. So it's interchangeable. So that example becomes very difficult to perceive sometimes. So if we step backwards, which I included in my book, and look at the big rock, the little rock, and a big stick, now you have one moving part that is the effort and one moving part that is the load. Okay, so you wedge that stick into that, under that big rock, you have that little stick here, and you press on this end and it moves that big rock. Okay, that's your class one
So
lever.
the big rock would be the fulcrum.
Would be the big rock would be the load.
Look,
The load is that thing which you are seeking to move, destroy, or rearrange.
Okay, you got the big rock on the bottom, and then you got the
No, you
stick
got the
going over the top.
No, the focus. It's on
Are you-
page, it's in chapter 3, pages 37 through 4.
Are you talking the seesaw still?
No,
Okay. Well, let me define fulcrum. Fulcrum's a center point, right?
correct. It's the pivot point.
Okay, pivot point. All right.
See the big rock,
Yeah.
the little rock?
Okay.
The
I
big
was
stick?
thinking just the opposite. I was thinking the big rock is underneath and you're trying to move the other one. Okay, I see what you're saying. Yeah.
You could just flick the little rock.
Well, depends on how little it is. I mean, you know.
well, not all rocks are the same.
Okay, so we have a first class lever. Okay, now beyond that, all of the other levers are merely the rearrangement,
Of the
which is
fulcrum.
cool because you can tie in the Ed Parker concept of the rearrangement concept into this. Or they are merely the rearrangement of those same four elements.
Now,
There
is
are
that one
only-
is that one we just did with the two rocks? Is that a first class?
Correct. That's a
Okay.
first class lever. Okay. Now, if we take that fulcrum and that rock, okay, and we switch those, we take the big rock and the little rock and we switch those, that becomes a second class lever. Okay. So now we're trying, and this is like a wheelbarrow. So the wheel out on the end has these handles that come up, and there's the carriage in the middle or the barrel, and then you lift it on the other end. So that is a second class lever. Okay. Second class levers are typically
And the wheel is like the little rock, basically.
correct.
But it's moving, obviously. 'cause
It's the
wheel.
fulcrum. It's the fulcrum.
Yeah, it'd be the fulcrum.
You can lift the load up and down around the wheel.
Okay.
That's where it pivots. Okay.
And that would be the effort lifting, right?
Right. That's clear back on the other end where the handles are.
Mm-hmm.
So the load is in the middle. Okay. This is not a commonly seen or used lever theoretically. However, when you get into trapping, hugging, holding, locking, choking, and strangulations, okay, second class levers become more prevalent, particularly in the martial arts. All right. Second class lever. Now we've taken our first class lever and we've gone from the fulcrum here and the load here. We've swapped those around. Now the fulcrum's here and the load's here, and we're going to lift that thing. Okay. Now what we're going to do is we're going to swap these two. We're going to put the load out on the end. The fulcrum's over here, and we're going to lift this rock from the middle. Okay. And that is a third class lever, which is likened into a shovel, and a shovel can actually be a compound. So I'll stay away from the shovel. Is likened to a hammer. Okay. Where I have the pivot or the fulcrum, the lever, the effort, and the load.
Like a broom.
Like a hammer.
Like a hammer. It makes more sense with a hammer.
A broom and a shovel are kind of the same. You can manipulate both pieces simultaneously, which incorporates a compound lever. And those are the three classes of lever. Now, they have varying degrees of effectiveness. They have, and I should state that the third class lever is the most commonly seen in joint locks and manipulations, okay, because of its arrangement. For example, in arm bars, okay, we have, where if I have I have an attribute that I teach on the end of sword and hammer, where you come in here and you come back up around and you hook the arm and you pull for an arm drag. An arm drag is ultimately a class 3 lever because you're fulcruming here, effort in the middle, load is they're the load. Okay, let's look at a technique we all know. Triggered salute. Okay, triggered salute. I come in, I heel palm, and I pull back. This trap is the fulcrum. Okay, this pull, I do my frictional pull, I collapse the arm, and I rotate the hips, and I bring that arm back. Okay, and in doing that, I am creating a third class lever. Okay, because my effort is in the middle, they themselves are the load, and the fulcrum is on my chest. So that's a third class lever. That makes sense?
Mm-hmm.
most of the joints in your body are comprised of, excuse me, first and third class levers, because you have tendons and ligaments that run across and pull back. Whew, that was fun, huh?
Well, you know what? It helps explain why these techniques work or why these principles are being used instead of just do this, do that. You know, which seems to be our mindset a lot in the community right now. But I'm optimistic that those that are understanding will seek this out to find a better way to do their Kempo, because they are going to say, well, it's just so limited. How am I supposed to grow with this? Well, this is how you grow.
So let's put it in perspective. If I give you a drill, a cordless drill, and you have never seen a cordless drill before, and you have no idea how it operates, how effectively are you going to use it?
Not very.
Not very. You can see some YouTube videos where guys are using screwdrivers for hammers and hammers for screwdrivers because they don't know what the hell they're doing with whatever tool it is, and they don't know what the true purpose is. So the point is, and I've seen guys use drills as a hammer to try and pound something in. That's not the purpose of the tool. That's not what it is for. If you understand the purpose and the application of a first class lever, a second class lever, a third class lever, you understand what the functioning parts and pieces are of that tool, and it is a mechanical tool, okay, then you can better understand. Only then can you study it and better understand how to apply it and use it more effectively.
This gets back to something I said many times. Mr. Parker would say, how much Kempo do you know of? Everybody knows a lot of everything. Then the second question is, how much do you actually know? Well, less than I know of. Then we get into the good part here. How much do you understand? So know of, know, understand. And now we're kind of in that area right now where a lot of people know of Kempo, you know, all kinds of parts of it. Some people know a good amount of it. They know about the universal pattern, so on and so forth. Do they really understand it? And well, it's, you know, a bunch of lines and, you know, ways in which you can travel and blah, da, 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 da. Okay, that's a partial understanding. That's a topical understanding. But do you understand how those paths relate to any given technique to make your technique better? And that's where the understanding comes in. That's where they're lacking. So this kind of study helps them understand greater that which what they thought they knew a lot of, or they did know, but it won't help them unless they know this and pass the understanding state to where they can actually then apply it. And that's the goal, is to really understand this material well enough to be able to apply it.
One of the things I'm really excited about is that people like Todd, and I spoke to Muhammad Tabatabai, have been back and have revisited our roots of Kempo Jiu-Jitsu. And it's really important because in the training, you know, I mean, if you look at Kempo the way it was historically, it's an assassin's system. Come on, just rip people's eyes out and crush larynxes and dismember this and that. And I mean, in the modern society, do we really want to do that? I think this is a nice alternative because it causes the opponent for compliance, you know, responses. Am I right there, Todd?
Absolutely. Yeah, and you know, it's funny. I want to go back to something that Dennis had touched on about, you know, if you make a new technique, it would be just part of this and part of that, and you know, I can see a little bit of this and a little bit of that in it, and that's absolutely true. And one of the things that I started doing a number of years ago was looking at and it, you know, contrary to some people's preachings, motion can teach you a lot of things, or you can learn a lot from motion. It doesn't all have to just be principle. One of the things that I did was I started looking at techniques like, you know, oh, look, delayed sword. And what does delayed sword truly have within it? Well, it is absolutely a striking technique, but it also is absolutely a jiu-jitsu technique. But Show me the jiu-jitsu in your delayed sword. Anybody?
You asking us a question?
Yeah, where's the jiu-jitsu in delayed sword?
Well, we're just gonna go right to Mr. Carter and Zach. Talk to
Why
us.
are you picking on me?
Low man of the totem pole, pal.
God, you got me here. The pin.
Okay, so it's a trick question. The pin is the beginning of the jiu-jitsu, but this motion right here actually puts you in a gooseneck. If I come back, I block, I grab that hand, and I pull this hand sword out, and I collapse that arm, and I rotate that wrist, it puts me in a gooseneck. It puts you in a Z-lock. Okay, delayed sword as a jiu-jitsu technique is an effective technique. Okay. So that's sequence rescripting.
And let me ask you this: did you bring back intellectual departure?
Did I bring it back?
Yeah, because he wrote it in the curriculum. It's been gone. I want it back. I liked it.
You're a big boy. Bring it back. Go ahead, Zach.
Yeah, I wanted to ask a question. What was the catalyst for you to start your investigation into this? What led you to this?
The of the book, I talked about one of my students who was actually, oddly enough, full circle. He was at one point in the Dave German system, and he was a brown belt. He came to Mr. Rainey, and he was on one of Mr. Rainey's hiatuses. He was training with me, and we were talking and discussing some things, and I was fascinated back then even with joint locks and manipulations and stuff, and thought that there was far more to it than I had, for sure. And so we were talking, and he asked me once, he said there's got to be a common denominator or a link between the striking and the manipulation side of the arts. There's got to be. Well, if you look at it, so if you look at it, if you take any joint locking motion, for example, this motion or this motion, if I take this motion of that wrist lock in twisted twig and I extend that just slightly, it becomes a downward block, or it becomes an outward downward hammer fist, or it becomes so many other things, right? So that's the link. That there is a common denominator, there is a common link, and it's the motion link. It's not the principle link, because the principles are different from one system to the next. The effect, the effectiveness, and the goal, the want and desire of that system is different. It has a different result and impact. It has a different result in touch. Okay, so you have to look at the motion link, right? This to this versus this to this is no different. And I have videos, I have a couple of videos on my Kempo Guy Productions site on YouTube, you can see, where I talk about sequence rescripting and show kind of some basic stuff about that.
Fascinating. Well, you know what, guys? It's that time where we're going to go, and we're going to stop at this point, because we've been going at it for some time, and we're just scratching the surface. I encourage everybody that is watching these videos to, if you have questions, please reach out to Mr. Durgan, or if you get a chance to talk to Mr. Conatser, they will be able to expand on us a little bit. If you get a chance to pick up Todd's book. By the way, where do you pick up this book, Todd?
KempoGuy.com or Amazon.com.
Okay, and it's really important. I have it, and I got to tell you, it's there's so much here. It's great. It's great reading. It'll help you with your journey of Kempo. Any last thoughts you have there, Mr. Carter, before we go?
It's just opening up Pandora's box, and I plan on studying and asking a lot of questions.
Oh, I think we're opening up the Pirates of the Caribbean's golden chest of jewels of information in there, rather than Pandora's box. Mr. Conatser, any thoughts before we close?
No, I think it's great. I think it's a joy to have Todd on. I really enjoy his analogies and his insights and the things that he's working on and going for. So I'd suggest anybody hopefully we'll see more of Todd and get some more of these things going, and people will be able to talk to him, and I'm sure he's open to conversations to help explain, a lot of this stuff to enhance everybody's Kempo.
Todd, your thoughts before we close.
Well, I appreciate being on here, and it's a humbling experience. I am grateful for the opportunity to share what little things that I've discovered along the way, along my path, and desire for discovery and to better myself as both a student and as a teacher. I mean, ultimately, once we've moved beyond a certain point, we need to focus on sharing what we have and helping to enlighten the next generations and help them be better students and better teachers as well. That's the only way we can propagate Mr. Parker's system and process of teaching and learning.
It was a wonderful discussion tonight. I really thank you, Todd, for taking time to explain these ideas and these theories and explain it through also examples. That was really great because it really solidified with me how these were applicable to our training, and we're grateful for that. So you're really onto something, Todd, and I know you'll have great success with it, and we'll continue on with this. And I want to thank everyone here. Thank you, Dennis. Thank you, Zach. Thank you, Todd. And with no further ado, good night, everyone.